of history have been so distorted by highly selective filtering as has the history of slavery. To many people today, slavery means black people in bondage.
Yeah.
The vast millions of people around the world who were black, but who were either slaves or enslavers for centuries, fade out to this vision of slavery as if it never existed, even though they may well have outnumbered both black and white.
Yep.
It has been estimated that there were more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere.
Preach it.
China, during the era of slavery, has been described as one of the largest and most comprehensive markets for the exchange of human beings in the world.
China.
Slaves were a majority of the population in some of the cities in Southeast Asia. At some period or other in history, as John Stuart Mill pointed out, almost every people now civilized have consisted, in majority, of slaves. When Abraham Lincoln said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," he was expressing an idea peculiar to Western civilization at that time, and by no means universally accepted throughout Western civilization. What seems almost incomprehensible today is that there was no serious challenge to the moral legitimacy of slavery prior to the 18th century. Christian monasteries in Europe and Buddhist monasteries in Asia both had slaves. Even Thomas More's fictional ideal society, Utopia, had slaves.
Yep.
Although intellectuals today may condemn slavery as a historic evil of our society, what was peculiar about Western society was not that it had slaves, like other societies around the world, but that it was the first civilization to turn against slavery, and that it spent more than a century destroying slavery, not only within Western civilization itself, but also in other countries around the world, over the often bitter and sometimes armed resistance of people in other societies. Only the overwhelming military power of Western nations during the age of imperialism made this possible. Slavery did not quietly die out of its own accord. It went down fighting to the bitter end in countries around the world, and it has still not totally died out to this day in parts of the Middle East and Africa. It is the image of racial slavery, white people enslaving black people, that has been indelibly burned into the consciousness of both black and white Americans today by the intelligentsia, and not simply as a fact about the past, but as a causal factor used to explain much of the present, and an enduring moral condemnation of the enslaving race. Yet two crucial facts have been filtered out of this picture. One, the institution of slavery was not based on race, and two, whites as well as blacks were enslaved. The very word slave is derived from the name of a European people, Slavs, who were enslaved for centuries before the first African was brought in bondage to the Western Hemisphere. It was not only in English that the word for slave derived from the word for Slav. The same was true in various other European languages and in Arabic. For most of the history of slavery, which covers most of the history of the human race, most slaves were not racially different from those who enslaved them. Not only did Europeans enslave Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, Polynesians enslaved other Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, after it became both technologically and economically feasible to transport masses of slaves from one continent to another, that is, to have a whole population of slaves of a different race, Europeans as well as Africans were enslaved and transported from their native lands to bondage on another continent. Pirates alone transported 1 million Europeans as slaves to the Barbary coast of North Africa, at least twice as many European slaves as there were African slaves transported to the United States and to the 13 colonies from which it was formed. Moreover, white slaves were still being bought and sold in the Islamic world decades after blacks had been freed in the United States. What marked the modern era of slavery in the West was the fact that, as distinguished historian Daniel Boorstin pointed out, now, for the first time in Western history, the status of slave coincided with the difference of race. But to claim that race or racism was the basis of slavery is to cite as a cause something that happened thousands of years after its supposed effect. As for the legacy of slavery in the world of today, that is something well worth investigating, as distinguished from simply making sweeping assumptions. Too many assumptions that have been made about the effects of slavery on both blacks and whites will not stand up under scrutiny. Back during the era of slavery in the United States, such prominent writers as the French visitor and observer Alexis de Tocqueville, and traveler in the antebellum South, and prominent writer Tim Helper, all pointed to striking differences between the North and the South, and attributed the deficiencies of the southern region to the effects of slavery on the white population of the South. These differences between northern and southern whites were not merely perceptions or stereotypes, they were factually demonstrable in areas ranging from literacy rates to rates of unwed motherhood, as well as in attitudes toward work and violence. But attributing these differences to slavery ignored the fact that the ancestors of white Southerners differed in these same ways from the ancestors of white Northerners, when they both lived in different parts of Britain and when neither had ever seen a black slave. Does the moral enormity of slavery give it any more decisive causal weight in explaining the situation of blacks today than it did in explaining that of whites in the antebellum South? There is no a priori answer to that question, which must be examined empirically, like many other questions. The fact that so many black families today consist of women with fatherless children has been said by many to be a legacy of slavery. Yet most black children grew up in two-parent families, even under slavery itself, and for generations thereafter. As recently as 1960, 2/3 of black children were still living in two-parent families. A century ago, a slightly higher percentage of blacks were married than were whites. In some years, a slightly higher percentage of blacks were in the labor force than were whites. The reasons for changes for the worse in these and other patterns must be sought in our own times. Whatever the reasons for the disintegration of the black family, it escalated to the current disastrous level well over a century after the end of slavery, though less than a generation after a large expansion of the welfare state and its accompanying non-judgmental ideology.
Yep.
To say that slavery will not bear the full weight of responsibility for all subsequent social problems among black Americans is not to say that it had negligible consequences among either blacks or whites, or that its consequences ended when slavery itself ended. But this is only to say that answers to questions about either slavery or race must be sought in facts, not in assumptions or visions, and certainly not in attempts to reduce questions of causation to only those which provide moral melodramas and an opportunity for the intelligentsia to be on the side of the angels. Just as Western Europeans in post-Roman times benefited from the fact that their ancestors had been conquered by the Romans, with all the brutality and oppression that entailed, blacks in America today have a far higher standard of living than most Africans in Africa as a result of their ancestors being enslaved, with all the injustices and abuses that entailed. There is no question that both conquest and enslavement were traumatic experiences for those on whom they were inflicted, nor is either morally justified by whatever benefits might come of this to subsequent generations of their offspring. But history cannot be undone, nor does conceiving of races as temporal abstractions have any such track record as to make it look like a promising approach to the present or the future.
Tom Sowell's a genius. I typed in there, hell, I'm an American-born citizen. I work in a position of servitude and am not afforded the same rights as the upper classes. I cannot vote, own a gun, worship as I choose, or even celebrate Halloween or homeschool my children. I am a slave, and Americans put me here, and they don't care one bit.
Saturday, April 23rd of this year, I will be in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for Better Discourse 4. See me and other creators like Blair White, Stephen Destiny Bottle, James Lindsay, Livy Evans, Carrie Smith, Lisa Reynolds, Nikki Klein, Sean Fitzgerald, and Taba'a. Get your tickets, Better Discourse event.com. One of the things that bothers me right here on the internet.com is this desire people have to avoid admitting that they're wrong. Now, granted, I've never had to do this because I've never actually ever been wrong, so I can't really empathize with that feeling because I'm always correct, and even if I was wrong, I'd never admit it, but I sure cannot stand when people know for a fact that they're wrong and they just never acknowledge that. And if you haven't heard what this is all based on, what this is all tying into, is the CDC is basically announcing that they're going to remove a bunch of the COVID restrictions that they had in place because a lot of them weren't backed up by our holy science. I know we're supposed to trust the science, we're supposed to believe the science, but every time the left is wrong about the science changes. And even when it changes to a position held by the right wing, don't worry, they're still not scientific. They're just evil and bad, and honestly, they don't trust the science, even though things seem to be aligning with what they said. But before we get into this, before we talk about shielding yourself from the virus, we need to talk about virtually shielding yourself from online viruses. Wow, what a great transition. Let me just give the asterisk that Virtual Shield does not prevent the transmission of coronavirus. The US government has been warning about cyber attacks for years, and some of the largest cyber attacks in our history have been tied to the Russians. Now more than ever, your personal data is vulnerable to these hackers. This is one of the reasons why I have partnered with Virtual Shield. Protect yourself from these hackers, and if you sign up for Virtual Shield at virtualshield.com/justice, you can get 50% off your lifetime subscription. Also, you got that thing if you like streaming in other countries, where you can change your location, virtualshield.com/justice.
You do not have to wear those masks. I mean, please take it. Honestly, it's not doing anything. We got to stop with this bogus theater. So if you want to wear it, fine, but this is ridiculous.
Now, the criticism, which I'm going to be highlighting one in particular from Chris Hayes' Twitter, was all about how Republicans are such liars and hypocrites because they talk about free choice and all that, but they will take it away as soon as they're in power, just in the same way that Ron DeSantis did in that clip that you definitely saw. Quote, incredible, predictable, how conservative ideology goes from, hey, it should be my choice, don't tell me what to do, to we are absolutely going to tell you what to do once we have the power to do it. Now, Chris Hayes must have had something in his ears, and maybe he didn't have his MSNBC patented problem glasses on, because this thing was actually subtitled, because in that very video, Ron DeSantis said, if you want to wear it, it's fine, and the video's only 17 seconds. So my question is, what is wrong with Chris Hayes, and why does he equate Ron DeSantis saying, you can wear it, it's fine, it's your choice, to removing a choice?
You do not have to wear those masks. I mean, please take it. Honestly, it's not doing anything. We got to stop with this bogus theater. So if you want to wear it, fine, but this is ridiculous. If you want to wear it, fine. If you want to wear it, fine.
Now, of course, we know why, because the left believes that if they find something or they determine something to be good, honorable, and noble, then that thing must be forced upon the people, because otherwise your inaction is actually some form of violence. And you can see this in their slogan, silence is violence. If you don't speak up, then you're a bad person. Yes, I didn't know a second slogan, and I don't know why I set up for it, but you get the picture. This is their worldview about everything. You either adopt their policies by force, or you garbage. Perfect example of this is the way that they feel about healthcare. they don't want to have a government plan or a public option. This was the big dispute among the progressives, because a public option wouldn't consume everyone, and if you have some kind of choice, there's a chance that you could make the wrong choice. Therefore, they need to correct that notion for you and make sure you make the proper choice. And all this also applies with mask mandates, whether that be in schools or vaccine mandates or any of those things. Now, in some instances, it is unfortunate when a left-winger actually has to give you the illusion of choice, but as you can see with the vaccine mandates in particular, what they do is they consistently punish you for not complying in order to compel you to comply, because they don't have the government authority to force you to comply. This is why you have the restaurant mandates. This is why you have all these different instances of them trying to get people fired from their job, increase their health insurance premiums, all the different democratic policy proposals that were basically intended to force you into compliance with the vaccine mandate, all because they believed that the vaccine mandate was good, but that went far beyond my belief that vaccines are generally good, and that they believe that they should force it upon you because it's good for you, and if you don't like it, congratulations, you don't know what's good for you, and none of your choices should be respected. Now, the culmination of this, by the way, has been in articles and all this, where the left has discovered that a lot of the things that they advocated for weren't very good. And to be fair, I do think the Canadian trucker convoy had something to do with this. They kind of changed the climate around this topic, even though people had been feeling this way for a long time, with this SNL scam, where they basically have left-wingers at a dinner talking about, and they're afraid the whole time to talk about, what people on the right have known this whole time, that a lot of this stuff is theater, and it is in fact ridiculous.
Oh, but Keith, you know you didn't take your mask off the table. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know I'm wearing it at the time.
Well, I heard the CDC is going to lift all mask mandates soon. Oh, yeah, I know.
It's so weird. It's like COVID's not over, but it's just gonna stop. I don't know how I feel about that.
Oh, you know, that reminds me of this article I
Oh,
read.
honey, no one wants to hear about that.
Well, it was in Bloomberg, and I thought it was interesting. What article? It was just saying how mask mandates had, I don't know, little to no effect on COVID.
Now, don't get me wrong, I love comedy. I love jokes, I love humor. I've done videos on this channel about how people trying to cancel comedians are ridiculous, and honestly, I do appreciate SNL now, at this point, mocking the crazies on the left for their COVID hysteria. However, the mask mandates are still in place in a lot of places. I just flew to CPAC. Guess what? You still gotta wear the mask on the plane, even though the science has changed. I know it makes a lot of people on the left uncomfortable. The science has supposedly changed, and we have determined that maybe this didn't really do a lot of things. By the way, I have to be cautious in my language, because even though the Bloomberg article that she referenced I can pull up and put on screen, I'm worried that YouTube, which by the way they did label this comedy sketch, will actually take action against me for pointing out the basics of what was said in the article, and how we should have expected this whole time for the data on this to change, and how a lot of this was guesswork from the jump. And that's really the issue I have, because remember, this wasn't an instance of people disagreeing about the efficacy of masks in an open public forum. This was an instance of the left in terms of the government and in terms of the social media arms, which left-wing politicians were putting pressure on, censoring anybody who spoke any kind of sense and who talked about what ultimately ended up looking like the actual conclusion about the efficacy of masks, as long as they were on the wrong side of the political spectrum. So SNL can do this, and it's laugh loud, funny, hilarious now. Look at all these lefties who are all upset about these mandates and how they bought into it and how they don't want to admit it, even though the CDC is basically admitting it and Bloomberg is admitting it, because, you know, whatever, but they did ban people from this. They took away people's livelihoods.
For instance, while I am so personally relieved that I'm vaccinated,
Be careful.
I sometimes wonder if other people who are hesitant, careful, might not have like a valid, not valid, but understandable.
Not tonight.
That was me.
The left supremacist attitude, their idea that everything that they're in favor for should be enforced, extended to censoring people who disagreed with their narrative. So laugh out loud, people at SNL, mock those lefties, But in reality, these aren't people that are just uncomfortable. These are all authoritarians. They're all bad people, or a large portion of them are bad people, because they wanted to sacrifice First Amendment principles, not just in the government, but in private lives, the idea, the culture of free speech, all on the altar of, we can't let this misinformation spread, even if this misinformation actually turns out to be the correct information.
I just think that if people are actually losing their jobs.
Careful, girl.
Look, vaccines save lives. Fact. Okay, they stop people from being overrun. Fact.
Where are you up to?
But did I have to dump my oldest friend because he didn't get a booster?
So they say that comedy works because of the underlying truth behind it. And honestly, right here, you know for a fact that this is legitimately how the left reacts to anybody who has any criticism at all of policy surrounding the vaccine, not the vaccine itself, because a lot of us aren't doctors. So I understand the skepticism of random internet people telling you about this or that related to the vaccine. But around the policy, they're like, oh no, they re at you literally like Keenan did right there. And this is generally, again, what we see. That being said, remember, people did lose their jobs over this. It was policy of the federal government to try to force people out of work if they didn't comply with Joe Biden's will. They tried the same thing and they implemented the same thing in a lot of schools, even though kids are